Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Miller, and I'm the Dean. And on behalf of the Director, Susan Weber, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's symposium, Visualizing 19th Century New York. The Bard Graduate Center, as you know, is an institution devoted to studying the past through its material traces, and that disposes all of us, but certainly disposes me, to think historically about events such as this one. And in fact, though invisible to anyone but myself, today's event began the gleam, so to speak, 8 years ago on a late night research session where the only research assistant I could get access to at that hour was, of course, Google. And thinking about the question, we had a job search going, thinking about the question of what the field should be for an institution such as our own, I thought that it would be interesting, since we at the Bard Graduate Center studied material culture, to see if there were a field called the material culture of New York City. So I typed in the string, and to my surprise and muted pleasure, discovered that there were only in the entire cosmos of Google 2 hits devoted to the material culture of New York City, and both of them referred to a session at a conference in Albany 2 years before, where both of the speakers were graduate students at the Bard Graduate Center. So this struck me, that's the muted pleasure part of it. So this struck me as an opportunity, and in the search that we were conducting, lo and behold, was David Jaffe, who was then beginning his turn towards material culture and craft manufacture in early America, with an interest that he was beginning to advertise in 19th century New York, and in particular, makers of things in 19th century New York, daguerreotypes, lithography, furniture, etc. And that evening began the trajectory that brought David here, and in fact brought him to this day and this project, which many of you have seen. Those of you who haven't will, I think, be astonished by the kinds of questions and the potential that he has unlocked. But in that same month, 8 years ago, was also launched the idea of the Focus Project, the idea of a small-scale exhibition devoted to faculty research, designed to be experimental in its pursuit of research in 3 dimensions, as opposed to the conventional textual orientation of scholars, with the idea that since our students go off equally to careers in academia and museums, to a kind of bilingual existence, that our faculty should also, though they were already very much disposed towards working with objects, should themselves be able to think and argue both in space as well as on paper. And I think much of what we have hoped for in the Focus Project, which has now run through, I think, 7 or 8 different projects, will be immediately visible to all of you when you have a chance to attend David's exhibition. It is experimental, it is driven by his own research questions, and more importantly, it is open-ended. It is not the idea of an exhibition as a closed box, but the idea that an exhibition, like the best kind of comparative scholarship, suggests and opens up questions for additional and further exploration. And as David will himself tell you, this project launched here is itself intended to be the beginning rather than the end of an inquiry he wishes to conduct. So it's a pleasure 8 years later to celebrate both of these events, and it is really my great honor to invite David to the podium to tell you something about this project. David.
Thank you, Peter, for your support in the project and many other things, along with our director, Susan Weber. And the students who really, with me, put together this exhibition, which truly, in the spirit of the Focus Gallery Project, was a collaborative one. And the digital publication that we have that's available online is composed of 20 essays that the students wrote as well. And this is a symposium on the occasion of the opening of this exhibition, but as I hope and expect, will go well beyond the parameters of the exhibition, and we were fortunate to have two distinguished scholars for the occasion of that opening of the Visualizing 19th Century New York that, as I mentioned, I curated with the critical collaboration of a group of Bard Graduate Center students. I hope you'll see the exhibition in the gallery, which is at 18 West 86 on this block, as well as on our website, visualizingnyc.org. And it has there a series of the gallery interactives as well as this digital publication. The project, that Focus Gallery project, attempts to capture how New York entered visual consciousness in the 19th century, that there were both new modes of perception, such as bird's eye views or other panoramas, or as well as street-level views with oyster peddlers and crowded tenements. The 19th century New York, as we try to argue in the exhibit, was a not-to-be-missed, sounds like today, not-to-be-missed visual experience for resident and visitor alike, and that the city was best captured and understood through the use of visual representations. But there's much more to be said about 19th century New York as a visual spectacle, and so for that, I'm grateful that we'll be able to turn to our two speakers today, Michael Clapper and Jonathan Prude. In particular, this afternoon, we will learn about 19th century art entrepreneurs in a comparative dimension. It is true that we will go even beyond New York to think about other cities as well. And we'll learn also how in this new world of mechanical reproduction, new opportunities for production and consumption of popular art was addressed for new audiences. There's really a plethora of what I call visual entrepreneurs that one can encounter. There were both new products as well as new ways of making those products and also new ways of making old products using old technologies. There's really an interesting set of transitional practices that are important to think about in terms of lithography in particular. But also, we'll also turn and think about New York, that in its structural and material forms, it was this also sounds like today. I didn't realize the echoes as I put down some notes, that New York was a divided city, was a divided world by gender, by ethnicity, and by class. And in that city that was riven by class, those structural elements entered into the visual dimension. The visual dimension, I would argue, I'm not sure what Jonathan will argue, also entered into the understanding of the structural elements. And this is an important part of the 19th century that we really need to think about, to recover those who are less than fully represented, or who are represented in a certain key, and thinking about that. So I think the structure, speaking of structure, the structure of speakers will be Michael first, so I'll introduce Michael and then I'll introduce Jonathan after Michael's talk. Michael Clapper is the chair of the Art and Art History Department at Franklin and Marshall College, where he's also a member of the American Studies Department. His work has focused on mass-produced art, particularly of the United States. He's interested in different kinds of popular images and types of art, particularly those that are deemed popular, that appeal to contemporary, in many cases 19th, but also 20th century viewers. He's published numerous articles on a variety of topics, such as chromolithography, a wonderful essay that I teach quite often. I Was Once a Barefoot Boy, Cultural Tensions in a Popular Chromo, that appeared in American Art. He's also written about the people sculptor, John Rogers, two very important articles in the Winterthur portfolio, as well as the exhibition catalog, John Rogers American Stories, that accompanied the retrospective Rogers exhibit curated by Kimberly Orcutt at the New York Historical Society 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something. He's also written on the work of Thomas Kincaid, published that in American Art, as well as curated an exhibition on making sense of Thomas Kincaid. And his current long-term project is about Maxfield Parrish. And he's going to speak to us today on art entrepreneurs, Currier and Ives, Louis Prang, and John Rogers.
All right, well, thank you, David, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. I want to consider with you today art entrepreneurs, business people who made their money selling art. And now you might think that any working professional artist is an art entrepreneur, right? That artists typically, they need not just to make art, but also to sell it, right? So it's running a small business, right? Beyond the producing the work, you need to be cultivating a clientele by personal relationships and advertising of some sort. You need to be looking for opportunities to sell more. But there's a confining limit to this sort of business, and that limit is the artist's skilled handcraft, right? It's painstaking, it takes time, there's a lot of uncertainty and inefficiency in the work, right? Because each object is unique and there's a sort of exploratory process of discovering what you're doing as you're going along. You can speed this up a bit if you're willing to specialize and to repeat yourself. Like, for instance, the 17th century Dutch painters who developed market niches by working within genres and subgenres and by adapting conventions and redoing their own previous designs. So I'll show you, for example, here a couple of still lifes by Willem Kalf. And you can see, right, that so he's not starting off a new painting with a blank canvas, yes, but he already has a sense of what a still life by him will look like, and he can reuse a lot of that material and sort of adjust it rather than inventing it for the first time. But to really increase production dramatically, an artist needs to leverage their handwork. And there are two main ways to do this. You can either use apprentices and assistants, or you can use machinery. Right? So this first way, the workshop system is a long-standing and still viable method of expanding your handwork as an artist, right? And it has a long tradition, but it rests on the assertion that it's the mental part of making art that's the most important, right? Baroque artists forcefully made this argument, and that beyond the intellectual work of inventing the design, right, the artist's main jobs were oversight and quality control. So this is true, for instance, with Peter Paul Rubens' example of the oil sketch on the left and the painting on the right, one of 24 huge paintings that he did now in the Louvre of the Marie de Medici cycle. Would have been impossible for him to actually paint all these paintings that are his paintings. They're mostly, he does the oil sketches, and the paintings themselves are mostly executed then by assistants, right? He runs a large workshop. He was very successful with this production model, with this business model, right? Here's his own painting of the manor to which he retired. So he became wealthy, right? He lived as a gentleman. While his Dutch contemporary Rembrandt, right, who also sought to be a gentleman, this is his aspirational self-portrait from 1640, but Rembrandt, he made a mistake. He didn't specialize, and he didn't delegate. And so instead of retiring to a manor house, he went bankrupt. In 1656, this is another self-portrait from a couple of years after that. So the workshop system, right? Maybe the greatest living example of a fine art entrepreneur running a workshop is Jeff Koons, who employs dozens of assistants. There was the article in Vanity Fair in conjunction with his current exhibition at the Whitney said 128 people that he employs. And this is just a photograph of just his painting workshop. And he also uses technically advanced fabrication processes, right, to produce exquisitely crafted objects, some of which sell for millions of dollars. Right? This is his balloon dog orange, right, outside of Christie's, just before it sold last November for $58 million. Right? So the highest price ever paid for a work by a living artist. So this is a tremendous example of the workshop system. But the workshop system still produces only a relatively few quite expensive objects. Using industrial mass production opens up new possibilities, right? So though the initial investment is large, in the end, the price per copy can be low. And that, in turn, broadens the audience, right? You have a much larger group of potential customers. So it's industrial mass production that made modern popular art possible. And so I want to look with you at 3 instances of the industrial mass production of popular art in the late 19th century. Right? So this is Currier and Ives prints, Prang's chromos, and Rogers groups. With the thought that looking at these 3 case studies will show us something of the range of possible variations, but will also give us a sense of the common features of this kind of art. Right? So I'll start out with the technical and business logistics challenges and end with the ways these art entrepreneurs engaged with and solved the aesthetic and cultural challenges involved with making and selling popular art. So the first key, the first thing that you have to do is to figure out a way to make a large number of high-quality copies cheaply. So in two-dimensional art, that's printing. In sculpture, it's casting. So, printmaking, this is nothing new. It's been used to make art less expensive since the 15th century, right? I mean, Dürer was doing this. But the invention of lithography in the early 19th century, and then the invention and adoption of steam-powered presses around the middle of the 19th century, allowed for a 1 to 2 order of magnitude increase in the number of copies that you could make using printmaking, as well as making the turnaround time much quicker. And so Currier and Ives, right, they're using plain black and white lithography, a single stone, 1 pass through the press. They also invented, it was actually Nathaniel Currier's brother, Charles, that invented their own lithographic crayons, which were better than the ones that they had previously imported from France. So they have some technical innovation of their own. But they're also mostly selling their prints hand-colored, right? They're hand-colored in watercolor. So this is an example of typical of Currier and Ives, where it's printed in black and white and then colored by hand in watercolor. That is quite different from Prang's chromos that were actually printed in color. And I'm showing you here a series of progressive proofs where he would print several layers, sometimes several dozen layers of color, right, transparent ink. You can see here in this proof print, if you look at the bottom, and the numbers are reversed, right, because they were written on the stone and then reversed in printing. But this is the colors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the layers of transparent color printed over one another to come up with the final image. And you can also see, you can also see here the registration marks, right, that were used to line up those layers. And so this was done, the color separations were done by eye, right? You can see here, this is a Prang print from a series of trades and occupations, and this is the lithographer. And so you can see the lithographic artist here with the finished painting, right, propped up in front of him. Above that, there's this ghostly proof print, and he's got the stone here and is working on pulling out by eye, right, with an outline keystone to guide him, pulling out by eye what should be the next layer of color, right, that he's putting on the stone. By the time that Prang published this print, the process that is depicted was already outdated, right? So Prang was not making chromos like this in his shop. He was rather using steam-powered presses and zinc plates instead of the lithographic stones. And you have a great opportunity in the exhibit to see one of these stones, that they're massive, hugely heavy. They're also expensive and fragile. So Prang is already showing I mean, I should say this is in the context of a series for school children of trades and occupations, right? So, but he's already showing an older way, not the modern sort of factory production. He himself, right? This is, you can see the sign there, L. Prang and Company's art publishing house. This is his print factory, or what he called his printery. And so he's using modern industrial production to make chromos. Rogers used flexible glue molds to cast his sculptures in plaster. The one major technical innovation he made in the course of his career was to switch from using a clay master model, right? So these flexible glue molds, you have the master model, you pour the glue over, you slice the glue apart, peel it away, and then you can put it back together, put it in a braced box and pour plaster into it. The one main innovation that he had was between his early groups, this is the slave auction on the left, and his later groups, this is Union refugees on the right. He went from clay master models to bronze master models. The bronze master models were a lot more expensive, right? They cost him somewhere between $450 and $1,500 to produce. So that's like 100 times what one of the finished groups cost. But those bronze master models are a lot more durable. So they allow him to produce a virtually unlimited number of copies without any degradation of the quality. And also just using the bronze as opposed to clay as the master model allowed him to make the groups larger, right? So slave auction is like so, and Union refugees is like twice as big. And so all the later ones are roughly twice as big and have a lot finer and more tightly cut surface detail, right? Again, because he's using a bronze instead of a clay master model. And so Rogers is able to produce at the far end of the continuum as many as 8,000 plaster casts of a single design. And so this is part of the challenge, right? Producing a large number of copies. Another part of the challenge was to develop a large inventory of a number of different designs, right? So that your customers could choose which they wanted. And Rogers was conscious of this even from very early on in his career. At the time when he had only produced a handful of his groups, he said, quote, "I do not depend on any one group or design, but on the great variety I shall get up in due course of time." Right? So he's always thinking of the breadth of his inventory of designs. Besides machinery, technology, and a range of designs, each of these art entrepreneurs also developed effective, efficient ways to organize labor. Right? So in each case, right, of course, there had to be an artist who would create the original designs. Curator and Ives, for instance, did this in various ways. They hired freelance draftsmen, some of whom would later start up their own companies. They relied on in-house draftsmen who could draw up a new image in response to the favorable reception of something that they had sold or in response to a current event in the news. They also employed artists who were just copyists, right, whose job was to transfer an existing image onto stones. In the case of Prang, somewhat different because the process of making a chromo always started with a finished painting. Prang bought those paintings from the artist along with the right to reproduce them. And Prang, he had to sell this idea to the artist to say, it'll be good for you if you have me make a chromo of your work. The argument that Prang made is that having your work chromolithographed would increase your reputation and that then you would be able to sell more paintings. Several artists bitterly lamented the fact that this was not the case. This is painting, well, this is the Prang chromo after a Benjamin Stone painting. This is called Harvest. This is from 1867. Benjamin Stone was the artist behind many of Prang's early successes, and Stone claimed that Prang had sold $21,000 worth of chromos of this image for $5 a chromo in the first year alone. Some of these chromos were in Prang's catalog for decades. Stone got $50 because that's what Prang had paid him for buying the painting outright. In a less characteristic case, Arthur Tate, right? He's the, when I was showing you that proof print of the chickens jumping out of the box, the Dash for Liberty. Tate got a special deal from Prang where Prang said, I'll give you 10% of gross sales for the first 2 years as a royalty. And Prang was writing and saying to Tate, I think this is a generous offer, and Tate wrote back to say, please don't say any more about being generous or we'll quarrel. Rogers was in a better situation, right, because he was both the artist and the business owner. And so for him, the challenge was to find and train skilled workers to do his casting and finishing. And so early on, he's complaining about how hard it is to find good workers to do work up to his standard. But by the time he gets established, by 1865, and there's an article in Scientific American about his process, there's enough interest in that process, he's employing 3 casters, 8 finishers, and 2 colorers. So this is a much smaller operation than that of Currier Knives and Prang, and also less industrialized. Rogers himself was the artist. He was the one who came up with all the designs. There were 80 of them in total, designs for Rogers groups. But in all of these cases, production entailed breaking down the process into discrete steps, each of them handled by a technician that was dedicated solely to that task. That division and specialization of labor fostered increased efficiency and refined skill in that one job. And it also decreased labor costs, right? Because the entrepreneurs were able to pay only for the skilled labor where and when they needed it. So, for instance, Currier Knives, they employed lithographic printers, but they employed a much larger number of hand colorers, most of them women, who were paid a lot less. After manufacturing, right, the next step was advertising and distribution. And in each of these entrepreneurs also developed effective means of advertising their wares. Right? So their markets were initially local. And so, for instance, Currier Knives, they allowed pushcart salesmen to come to their shop and take prints on deposit. They leave their money in the morning, come back that night, and get back the money for whatever they had not sold. Currier Knives also, though, distributed their prints much more broadly, partly by sending out a catalog to agents who could choose whatever they wanted from the catalog and then hold those prints in their own inventory. So there's a sort of sifting and sorting that Currier Knives is trying to assess what will be popular, and then their agents are making a selection from that to say, well, what do they think they can sell? Prang, right, he published his own journal called Prang's Chromo that contained articles and testimonials, and he was just sort of drumming up interest in and awareness of chromolithographs. He also attached price lists to the back of each chromo, so that if you got one, then you would also have with that the lists of what else he sold. Rogers used a whole range of techniques, including with the slave auction, he hired an African-American man to walk the streets of New York trying to sell it. This was an early experiment, not continued. He also maintained a showroom on Broadway. He also offered high-end retail stores the chance to have groups to display in their window with the hope that people would be interested coming to the store and buy them. Rogers, though, he was firm in the condition that if you were going to sell his groups, you had to sell them at his retail price. Right? So this sort of one price policy. It also had to do with his shipping. Right? So he would send the group wherever he would deliver it, all at one price. So it didn't matter whether you brought it from his showroom, from a retailer, from an agent in some faraway city, you would pay always the same price. I think that is a way for him to not only control his market, but to maintain the perception of the value of his work. So you never saw a $15 group sold for anything less than $15 until he decided, well, that one's not selling so well, I'm going to drop the price a bit. He also, Rogers, he sent his groups around to newspapers, apparently with self-written copy that the newspaper editor could then just print straight away without having to write anything. We know this because in his scrapbooks, there are identical articles in papers in different cities. He also he printed a complete illustrated catalog. This is a page from his 1877 catalog. For a nominal cost. If first it was a stamp and later it was 10 cents, you could get this catalog, and you can see each group. There's a picture, right? There's a wood engraved illustration. There's a description below of the subject. There are also just below the group its dimensions and its price, right? And so Rogers proposed that a prospective buyer could, quote, select as well as if he had the whole collection before him. Right, that with the catalog, it was just as though you were seeing the groups. You could buy whatever you wanted, and then how to actually deliver the goods, right, for these art entrepreneurs. Well, the developing railway network and the U.S. mail system made it possible to distribute these works widely and cheaply, right, so that you could have regional and eventually national markets. The task was the trickiest maybe for Rogers because his groups were large and heavy and fragile. But he nonetheless guaranteed that he would deliver it safely to anywhere in the United States. He did this by packing them upside down in wooden crates full of sawdust. And apparently very few of them got broken. But popular art, it not only has to be known and available, it has to be sold at affordable prices. Right, so Curator knives, they were at the low end, right? Small black and white prints retailed for about 25 cents. The fanciest, largest hand-colored Curator knives images sold for about $2 to $3. Prang also had some offerings on the low end, but his full-blown chromos, right, like the Barefoot Boy, that sold for $5. Right? Some of them were as much as $10 or $20. And Rogers groups, most of them sold for between $10 and $15. That's maybe too pricey for ordinary laborer who would at the time have been making about $1.50 or $2 a day. But it's quite affordable to a salaried middle-class professional as a focal point for a respectable home. And all of these prices compare very favorably with what a decent painting would have cost. This would be at least $50 on up to buy a painting, much less the hundreds or thousands of dollars that it would have cost you to buy a sculpture in marble or bronze. And so these art entrepreneurs were very enthusiastic about the possibility then of ordinary people having art. So Prang declared that his chromos were the democracy of art, right? That they were not only, as he said, absolute facsimiles of the originals, but, quote, their price is so low that every home may enjoy the luxury of possessing a copy of works of art which hitherto adorned only the parlors of the rich. Curator knives, they're less pretentious. One of their letterheads read, Curator knives, publishers of cheap and popular prints. But still, it wasn't enough to make the works cheaply. right? They had to come off as real art. All these popular prints and sculptures were copies that had to pass for originals. Right? So to make it so that middle-class buyers could take these works into their homes as genuine art, they had to have a believable appearance of artistic authenticity. Right? So in the case of Curator knives, right, the tradition of printmaking as a popular art going back to the 15th century, also the more autographic quality of lithography as compared with other printmaking techniques, also the hand coloring, right, in watercolor of the prints, and finally the careful targeting by Curator knives of groups of subjects as suitable for particular rooms in a home. So you would have images like this food still lifes meant for the dining room. All of that made these prints seem suitable for framing and display in a domestic setting. Prang made his chromos out to be more like paintings than prints. Right? So he claimed that the vast majority of people couldn't tell the difference between a chromo and a painting side by side, that they would get just as much out of the chromo as the painting. This is a detail, Barefoot Boy, the painting on the left and the chromo on the right. So you could see what you think about the claim that you can't tell the difference. But that claim was partly a boast about his dedication to accurate imagery production. And then he also enhanced the effect, right, making his prints, his chromos look more like paintings by embossing them. Now, this is something that is very difficult to see in reproduction, but perhaps you can see in the dark blank areas at the edge that the prints are embossed with a canvas-like texture, and then they're also varnished. And so that brings up what is otherwise flat and dull color, but also makes them have a sort of surfacey look of like a painting. And then Prang also gave advice for framing them, where he would have you frame them in walnut frames with no margin. Right? So usually when you frame prints, you frame them with a large white margin around the edge. Chromos, and you can still see it. So, in fact, I have a copy of this Barefoot Boy print. They're on board, right? They're on a heavy cardboard with only about the margin that you see here, less than 1/4 of an inch, so that you would frame them right up to the edge, and that they would look as much as possible like paintings. That led Prang's critics, right, to decry chromos as deceptive, but his satisfied customers and more sympathetic advocates like the Beecher sisters thought, no, this is wonderful, right? This really is the democracy of art. Rogers groups came out of the mold in pieces, right? So they didn't cast the whole group at once, they cast it in pieces. The wires that attached those pieces together would be sticking out. The color of the thing would be kind of this yucky, off-white, mottled color. It would have pock marks from the casting. And so this is when I read you the list of the people that Rogers employed. 3 casters, 8 finishers, right? So he's got more people on the job of putting the pieces together, grinding down the seams, filling in the casting imperfections. And then finally, right, as you see, you'll see them in different colors. The one that's over in the gallery is sort of a light grayish color. They range from light gray to dark brown. They're painted. They're painted to look like the clay in which Rogers originally modeled them. And in fact, he published the formula that you could repaint these yourselves because they get dinged up, so that he wanted homeowners to be able to take care of them, so that you would take zinc white oil paint and either burnt umber or raw umber and mix them together, and you could touch up the paint job on your Rogers group. But what he's doing, right, why paint them like this is to try to suggest a closer connection to the hand of the artist than was actually the case. Right, so these efforts allowed prints and casts to read not just as merchandise or as copies of works of art, but as themselves works of art, right? And that was important to the people who bought and proudly displayed them in their homes. And so this is something that I think is important, making a distinction between visual culture and art, right? These works were thought of as works of art, right? And that art was thought of as serving purposes that other kinds of objects didn't serve, like refining your taste, or elevating your morals, or educating the young. But at the same time, right, so there's sort of some highfalutin goals, right, for these popular art objects. But at the same time, these art entrepreneurs were trying to make this work as approachable as possible. They were not trying to dictate artistic taste, but were rather giving people what they wanted. And so this is, I want to suggest that popular art is a particular kind of art. It's not just that art is made and that some art becomes more well-liked or more widely sold than others. In order to produce popular art, you must be making a deliberate effort from the beginning to make art that a lot of people will like. From the beginning. Part of that is a business necessity, right? Because it costs a lot to produce that first copy, right? So yes, it's possible to decrease the price per copy, but you have to sell a lot of copies, right? So Prang, for instance, he was very well aware of this. He said, it costs thousands of dollars to make a fine chromo, and then, quote, "It follows that a chromo can be successful commercially only when several thousand copies can be disposed of." And so entrepreneurs of popular art had to seek a large audience or their businesses would fail. Well, how then can you give their productions the broadest possible appeal? Part of it was the style, right? So the style is representational, obviously skillful, but it's unobtrusive, right? It seems as though you can look through it, right? It's a style that has a lot of carefully selected details, lends itself to anecdote and narrative, right? We can see, for instance, with Rogers' groups, especially, he's rejecting the neoclassical style that was then dominant, right? So that is, on the left is Hiram Power's Greek Slave from 1846. Rogers had this in mind. This is what he was being told to study up to learn how to produce this sort of neoclassical sculpture. This was not the sort of thing that he was inclined to do, right? Just in terms of his own artistic interests and talents. And so he instead developed his own type of folksy naturalism, right? That drew viewers in using props to tell the story. So you can see in the gallery the copy of this group, Checkers Up at the Farm, from 1875. And just look with me at how the story is told. So he's able to set the scene, right? It's up at the farm. And you know that because of the furniture, right? So you have the sapling-bound barrel, the turned upside-down basket for a seat. This is at the farmer's place. And they're playing checkers. How's that game going? Well, you can see from this like smiling expression and the pointing finger, and you can look at the position on the board, right? That the farmer has backed up their kings on the board, and he's backed up his city slicker opponent's pieces so that he can't move except that they'll get jumped. And so it's the details, it's the expressions that tell the story and also just make things more interesting. There's a cat that's batting at a checker that's fallen off the board. The kid is about to kick some of the checkers off the board. And so it's a shame in the exhibit that you can't do as people would have at the time and just like come right up to them, right? And then even walk around them. But also, you're not really meant to go around the back, right? So they're meant to be seen mostly from the front. So you get most of the detail that way. Rogers, incidentally, he loved these little, he called them accessories or anecdotal details, and he thought that in his own assessment of the Greek Slave, why that was so successful was because of the chain, right? The chain told the story, and that's why that work of art was seen by, as it was, by hundreds of thousands of people who paid 25 cents admission to get in. And so that's the alternative business model, right? If you want to do fine art and have a mass audience, you send it on tour. The gestures, the expressions of the people in Rogers groups are enjoyable to read, but also they're pretty simple to read. I'll just say that as a sort of counter example, there was a contemporary account that got into looking at the expression of the standing woman in this group and found that, in fact, she had two distinct expressions, one on each side of her face. I'll quote, "Over that turned towards her husband is spread a mischievous smile mingled with a little wounded pride, while over that presented to the triumphant farmer is an expression of conventional politeness." But so that's about as complicated as the emotions in Rogers groups got. I have to read you another quote. I love this quote. This is from Laredo Taft, The History of American Sculpture, published in 1903. He's speaking of the characters in Rogers group, and he says, "One understands them readily, for their mental equipment is devoid of subtle complexities. Their little clay brains are as free from conflicting emotions as are their faces and clothes from suavity of modeling." So he's not a fan exactly, but he's still saying that Rogers is, in the history of American sculpture, is a notable figure. And what is it that Rogers has? Well, it's this apparently transparent style and delightful anecdotal detail. It is also, though, that the entrepreneurs of popular art deliberately avoided controversial subject matter. Right, so Rogers, for instance, wrote a letter to his sister explaining, quote, "I may think of a very effective design which would be unpopular and which would not do to undertake. Now the slave auction, which you mentioned, that's this group, gave me probably more satisfaction to make than any other of my small groups." By small, he means before the Bronze Master models. "But I sell less of it than almost any other group. By taking a subject on which there is divided opinion, of course, I lose half my customers." And so the subjects for popular art, it couldn't really be anything that was difficult or disturbing or unfamiliar. So instead, art entrepreneurs interested in reaching a large clientele favored emotionally engaging subjects, often sentimental, right? So things like the Barefoot Boy, or Group of Chickens, right? This is a bestseller of Prang's by Tate again. And also the subjects of popular art tended toward reinforcing traditional values and roles, right? And nostalgically looking back, or I would say imagining an ideal past, or somehow trying to pull that into the present. So, for instance, this is Rogers' most popular group, Coming to the Parson. And you see there's a young man and woman coming to be married. They conform to stereotypical roles, right? So you've got this somewhat gawky but still respectful young man. The woman is sort of behind him. She is nervously chewing on her scarf. So the young people, they might be a little bit impulsive, but they're still bending to ritual. They're still respecting their elders and social convention. Also, remember that these are, and this is true of a lot of popular art, that the audience is mostly urban, but the scenes depicted are mostly rural, right? So this is not a New York City wedding, right? This is a country wedding. And so there's a way in which this popular art is for the sake of that urban audience that wishes for the earnest simplicity that's portrayed in the art. Indeed, a lot of the appeal of this sort of art was the cultural and social work that it could do. Right? So, yes, it brightens up otherwise plain interiors. It gives them a patina of sophistication. It helps the owners of these domestic spaces show themselves to their friends and family as culturally sophisticated, right? That they own and display art. It also provides a common ground for the development of a middle-class identity that is devoted to self-improvement, right? And so self-improvement partly through the elevating potential of art and also through the moralizing quality of a lot of the images themselves. And, right, this kind of art acted as a buffer to the prevailing materialism of the era, right? So that it reassures its viewers of the enduring social roles and ways of life that they can see in the images at a time when, in fact, there's rapid social change and dislocation. Finally, however, I would suggest that though in style and subject matter and function, this popular art might indicate otherwise, there was a close and even causal relationship between popular art and modern industrial capitalism. These art entrepreneurs ran businesses that were made possible by industry, machinery, capitalist markets for labor and goods, right? And so even though paradoxically the art that they produced or reproduced elides or glosses over these economic and technological realities, right? So there's a purposeful lack of reference in these images to contemporary urban life and to industrial production. And that's not just a coincidence, right? That is meant, oddly enough, to counteract, to serve as an antidote to the very developments, the very economic and social developments that made this art possible. So this is a phenomenon that starts in the middle of the 19th century and has continued to this day, right? So I'll just show you quickly a few later examples, right? This is Daybreak by Maxfield Parrish, Saying Grace, one of the most beloved Saturday Evening Post covers by Norman Rockwell, and then by Thomas Kincaid from 1995, The End of a Perfect Day 3. And so whether it's the artist themselves that imagines the image, or perhaps that the artist is the hired help, the creative talent for the entrepreneur, or somewhere in between, popular art like that made and sold by Kerr Knives and Prang and Rogers was a mass market commodity that denied the conditions of its own making, and instead presented a nostalgic, reassuring fantasy of a simpler, less troubled time. So what made this art possible, what made it emotionally needed, that it couldn't show. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we'll do the next talk, and then we'll have a break, and then discussion. Jonathan Prude teaches history in the history department at Emory University. He's the author of the important study of industrialization, The Coming of Industrial Order, Town and Factory Life in Rural Massachusetts, 1810 to 1860, as well as the, again, another wonderful collection, the country's... Yes, yes. I'm also in the Rogers collection, too, I realized, too, when I was putting this together. Be that as it may, The Countryside in the Age of Capitalist Transformation, Essays in the Social History of Rural America. I think Jonathan calls himself a social and cultural historian with a greater turn towards the cultural realm in recent years. He's the author of articles such as To Look Upon the Lower Sort, Runaway Ads, and the Appearance of Unfree Laborers in America, 1750 to 1800, in the Journal of American History, as well as something that was very important for our Focus Gallery course sequence when we were putting together the exhibit, Engaging Urban Panoramas, City Views of the Antebellum North, in the online journal Commonplace. And Jonathan is interested in the relationship of class and culture in the long 19th century, which is manifest in his major project, The Appearance of Class, the Visual Presence of American Working People from the Revolution to World War I. And today he's going to speak on the look of lesser sorts in 19th century New York.
So how do I, with regret, exit from this?
Just keep going. They're showing to go. So you can, if you keep going.
Back. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, David. Let me begin, in fact, by thanking you and your colleagues at Bard for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. The exhibit David's organized with his students and that provides a scaffolding for the symposium is a splendidly rich exploration into and evocation of a compelling undertaking, what David calls, as you know, visualizing 19th century New York. If you haven't visited the exhibit, I'd urge you to do so. It's a real treat. And the intellectual venture it proposes of considering New York as a visual phenomenon is one I'm in fact most eager to join. Part of my eagerness is that I think what's involved here is different from the more familiar project of illustrating 19th century New York. To me, illustrating the past entails supplementing our usually written investigations with descriptions and pictures. It means using such depictions to accent, illustrate what our texts have anyway interpreted and analyzed. There's nothing wrong with this. It's, of course, nice to know what historical individuals and things looked like, but I suspect it's not what visualizing New York, 19th century New York implies. I think what this exhibit is ultimately inviting us to think about is the full historical connotations of visuality head on. I think it's inviting us to ponder how contemporary descriptions and images were created and experienced, as our last speaker got into. I think it's inviting us to ponder how, more than that, I think it's inviting us to consider the full visual register of history, the full array of representations and visually engaged activities as a point of departure, as the place we start for our investigations. I think that is, it's inviting us to treat the visual texture of the past as having its own import, and that knowing how history appeared is not just a nice add-on, but delivers its own powerful insights. I think it's inviting us, in short, to consider what difference it made that history was, in fact, deeply seen. So I am, as I say, pleased to join this symposium. I'm also pleased David has agreed that the specific way I might contribute to our deliberations is by exploring those niche beneath the mostly middle-class visual entrepreneurs and their Broadway-centric activities that his exhibit foregrounds. For I do believe it would enrich our discussion if we take account of the visual presence of the city's lesser sorts, and they're often non-Broadway activities. The presence, that is, of what I also call laboring people, working people, those below, plebeian actors, as I variously style them. But why? Why do I believe that treating the visuality of such individuals would be useful? First, and I guess I take this as an active assumption, because working people were constitutive of New York in this period. And second, because I'd argue that a vital factor shaping the life and labor of the city's working population was their visuality. But I'd also argue the visuality of these individuals rested on a key relationship, the relationship between how laboring folk were regarded by those outside their ranks, on the one hand, and how they made their own way through the paths of visuality on the other. In truth, I'd propose that the overall visual culture of 19th century America, construed as the aggregate of observations, representations, and self-presentations loose in the milieu, this whole culture encompassed interactions among different constituencies. But if this obtained generally, I think it particularly applied to lesser sorts. The appearance of working people, including the working people of 19th century New York, was centrally shaped, I think, by the interplay between how they were observed and depicted by non-laboring others, and how they presented and represented themselves, undertook their own observations, and trafficked consequently in commodified amusements linked to visuality. Or, as I try to signal in my title, the appearance of lesser sorts turned on interplays between, on one side, the look of these people, construed as a thing, as the visual impression others had of and made and attached to them, and on the other, their look understood as a process, a verb, as something they actively did. But now, quickly, naturally, some caveats. To distinguish, as I just have, between lesser sorts and others implies a sharp distinction that in practice was often far from clear or fixed. It also ignores the fact that these two broad collectivities were themselves often divided, not least by gender, race, and their own internal economic rankings. And I should acknowledge, too, that a talk like this can only sketch at the full complexity woven into the visuality of 19th century New York and its lesser sorts. I'm aware of all this, and indeed I'll try in what follows to note some of the variations cross-cutting the protagonists of my talk. And while I'll occasionally season my discussion with sources that originated elsewhere but circulated through Gotham, I will try and make an effort to limit the scope of what I'm going to say by limiting myself to the antebellum era. Yet I'd also contend there's a value in speaking loosely and broadly, for it allows us to appreciate that if the line between lesser sorts and others was imprecise, it was also trenchant, that if working people and others were both internally fissured, they nonetheless each shared overall characteristics, including that of contrasting measures of subordination and empowerment in the Republic, and that even a brief sketch can yield leverage on the look of lesser sorts in 19th century New York. So now, what was that look? I'll start by suggesting that between the Revolution and the Civil War, American working people, like those in New York, came to be more viewed and depicted by others, generated primarily by white and male observers, writers, sculptors, and picture makers. This regard, using that term as my summary rubric, found representational expression in texts lodged in the contemporary outpourings of books, pamphlets, and periodicals, and the key representational form I'm going to use, images ranging from paintings to prints, and after 1839 in photographs. Such enhanced visual attention suggests that working people were recognizable as workers. But this is tricky, because antebellum America was home to a burgeoning multi-million-dollar apparel business, much of it based in New York, that was rapidly transforming the clothing of laboring sorts. For non-chattel women, there arose new opportunities to buy inexpensive but stylish shoes, cloaks, hats, and hoops, which, coupled with the growth of inexpensive cloth, cheap dressmakers, and these women's own ingenuity, allowed lesser-ranked females to appear in versions, at least, of current fashion. Working men likewise availed themselves of cheap but elegant-looking shoes and hats, as well as ready-made iterations of upscale-looking shirts, trousers, and coats. Except not always. Ready-made suits were frequently ill-fitted and made of manifestly cheap cloth, and the elegance of working women betrayed itself as not truly modish by material cut and not quite proper color choices, so that working people might be and were detected by close examination of their apparently upscale outfits. But they were equally detected because they often wore garments that had little resemblance to upscale, that were expressly intended for labor. These too might be generated at relatively low cost by the clothing business, but they were in any event often recognizable as workaday costumes of laboring folk. Thus Whitman, in this case actually standing on Broadway in the 1840s, watched manual workmen pass by in, quote, brick-dusty shirts and overalls, battered hats and shoes, white or burnt with lime, armed with pick, spade, and trowel or hod. Even tradesmen, like butchers, now how do I do this? Help? I knew that. Okay. Even butchers Even tradesmen like butchers, who customarily labored in cutaway coats and top hats, used the craftsman's traditional apron to signal his position. This is one of Kallio's, watercolorist Italia's images of street scenes in New York in the 1840s. In fact, contemporary picture makers frequently assumed those viewing images of laboring men in workaday garb would know not just the standing, but the specific occupation of these figures simply from their clothing and the tools many carried as accessories to their outfit. Help. See, a political print from the 1837-38. They are not identified by trade except by their image. To be sure, women, though starting to enter the paid labor force in growing numbers, did not yet have consistent costume markers denoting waged employment, a situation that meant household mistresses engaged in daily chores could be confused with servants. By the 1840s, however, some women laboring outside homes were using simple short-sleeved garments whose name at least did evoke paying jobs, mill dresses. You can just see her behind the loom. So lesser sorts were to some fair degree visually identifiable. But how then did the regard directed toward them treat lesser sorts? Not surprisingly, it embodied a variety of impulses. But, speaking here in my recklessly loose and general way, I'd propose its intention was frequently explanatory. And the substantial frequency and scope of this explanatory tilted regard thus reflected widening convictions that at a time of accelerating and often bewildering change, taking account of lesser sorts was necessary for understanding and in some case exposing how, say, work sites functioned, how news events from trials to riots should be interpreted, how slums subsisted in large cities, and how racial and ethnic minorities did or did not fit within the nation. But there were also strands of regard of lesser sorts by others that were fundamentally judgments. On the one hand, and frequently reflecting enthusiasm for the nation's democratic ethos, there was regard provided upbeat renderings of working folk, from street sellers like Kallio's to craftsmen idealized as cheerfully reconciled to industry. I love this. As our ideal male worker, like the kind of image grafted into paper currency, like this, swirling across communities like New York. On the other hand, there was regard reflecting growing conviction that many lower sorts were problematic, that the Republic faced dangers from below. Hence, there were representations depicting assorted lesser sorts as morally wayward. And importantly, there were spreading structures of intensified surveillance. There was, that is, a spreading regard announced through both viewings and representations of viewings and linked directly to instrumental authority that were invested in preventing or encouraging particular behaviors among those below. Such regard attached to bolstered slave patrols in the South, to increasingly professionalized police in both the South and North, and across the nation to strengthen workplace oversight. It attached as well to inflections of paternalist control during and after working hours, and what was certainly evident in New York, to the uplifting mission of reformers. In practice, of course, the situation was more complex. Different working people were seen in different ways. Explanatory and judgmental regard often overlapped, as in genre images, for example, and there was regard that mixed or ricocheted between positive and cautionary. Perhaps not surprisingly, African Americans faced especially intense offsetting regardful assessments, and representational expressions of these ricochets unquestionably cycled through New York. On one side, support of chattel servitude yielded vignettes of contented slaves, while northern white racial hostility, in some cases actually sharpened by the dismantling of slavery, prompted prints mocking the pretensions of free blacks. We all know probably Clay's notorious images of overdressed free black. This is based in Philadelphia, of course, but it cycled through New York and had analogs in New York. Which in turn gave, especially after the rise of abolitionism in 1830, there arose depictions from white anti-slavery advocates who, with women often taking prominent roles and with frequent appeals to the special emotive adherence of sympathy, coupled continuing invocations of slaves meriting freedom with heightened stress on their suffering, like so. which in turn prompted critiques of excessive white to black empathy, amalgamation, back to clay, and thence back again, as in Uncle Tom's Cabin, to sympathy. Back and forth. Then, too, providing further complications, there were instances of the visual culture and images particularly declining to address the social order head-on. And this was, I think, evoked in passing by our last speaker. Efforts to picture ideal female wage laborers, for example, could devolve into, I think, genuinely weird fantasies. I give you Columbia with a sledgehammer. Again, on paper currency. And it was rare to include slaves in plantation landscapes or to picture them resisting bondage, to photograph slums, or, for the most part, treat any laborers in painted portraits. Joined to other glitches and silences and playing out variously across high and low graphic forms, such detours in the pictorial record suggest that graphics, if not as much, if not more than other kinds of representations, could have difficulty dealing with certain topics relating to those below. Still, I'd argue that the overall regard, the viewings, written descriptions, and graphic delineations bearing on working people from the outside in these years was substantial. Indeed, I'd argue that whereas a signature feature of lower sorts in provincial America was to be relatively unregarded by others, a major element of being lesser ranked in antebellum America was to be increasingly regarded by the non-lesser ranked. But as I've indicated, my further argument is that working people had a hand in making their own visuality. Or to put more starkly, notwithstanding the influence and in some cases the coercive surveillance force of the regard pressing upon them, lesser sorts evince considerable determination to go their own visual way. The visual agency I'm exploring had its own substantial variations among different kinds of people, as well as in form, intensity, and purpose. But while I'll be dealing with just a few examples, I trust it will become clear that the visual initiatives from below were very much in play. Let's start with portraits. I noted a moment ago that laboring folk rarely ended up in painted portraits in these years. This was because while post-revolutionary America was host to painted likenesses that did reach below the elite, sub-middling lesser sorts rarely could afford even inexpensive limners, while artists, for their part, were rarely willing to undertake uncommissioned portraits of lesser-ranked subjects. More possible, however, was for lesser-ranked authors to appear in portrait prints introducing their texts, likely sponsored by publishers or supporters, but almost certainly reflecting the wishes of those pictured. The images generally follow precedents in frontispiece pictures by featuring figures in polished, albeit likely ready-made, upscale attire to declare the seriousness of the authors. But the pictures of lesser-ranked authors, particularly the prints of fugitive slave authors, crafted by African-American artists to introduce runaway narratives and issued in the very teeth of cartoons mocking well-dressed blacks, like the clay images, these portraits, I think, might have carried an edgier message, that even plebeian authors, even black plebeian authors, merited respectful attention. Thus, the frontispiece portrait by the New York black artist Patrick Reason for Henry Bibb's narrative in 1849. New possibilities emerged in the 1850s. Collaborations between sitters and rank-and-file operators of comparatively cheap photographic technologies allowed at least some working people unprecedented opportunities to acquire camera-made portraits of themselves as they wished to appear. And it turns out they wished to appear not only in the nice garb generally prescribed for portraits, but now and again in the dress and tools of everyday labor. Some of these images, so-called occupationals, were used by tradesmen as personalized advertisements. But no less likely, I think, and despite the pressure of industrialization and the economic downturns that buffeted many laborers in these years, they also stood, these images, as declarations of defiant pride in their crafts, and indeed even of manual work generally, like so, a cabinet maker. But sometimes these down-dressed photographic likenesses hint at yet further implications. For sometimes they seem to me to blend workaday attire with whimsical poses. Most famous, of course, is the daguerreotype Whitman had made of himself in Brooklyn, an image of rough and ready, hip-cocked suggestiveness he used as the frontispiece portrait for the first edition of Leaves of Grass, precisely to separate himself from authorial respectability. Right? But there are also photographic portraits of anonymous lesser sorts, some of them likely common laborers, that fuse everyday attire with playful gestures, jauntily chomped on cigars, for example. Gestures by which lesser sorts seem to me to evince their determination to have fun, and hence make the camera-made looks their very own. Another instance of working folks striving to make their visuality turned on uniforms. Not military outfits, but costumes imposed by civilians on civilians by one or another authority, and hence, because they were imposed, apparel experienced as diminishments of independence. The poor and incarcerated criminals were variously assigned mandatory outfits. In the South, the badges stipulated for free blacks to show they were not slaves, and for hired slaves to show they were, likewise connected obligatory costumes with servility. And so did the special taint of liveries. From provincial times forward, many in America contended that assigning distinctive garments to personal retainers smacked of old world aristocracies, and if used on this side of the Atlantic, was best limited to slaves or free black servants. So, especially among white lesser sorts, or those advocating on their behalf, an important strand of visual agency entailed resisting the look of uniforms. And interestingly enough, some of the most intense installments of uniform issue, notably in New York, came among firemen and police. Until the 1860s, firefighting in New York was handled by volunteer companies, many of which by the 1830s had molted into vibrant white working men's social organizations. They were organizations, moreover, that prided themselves in manly fraternal independence from any overreaching authority. And importantly, they signaled their autonomy visually. The laddies, as they were called, pulled hand-pumpers engines through the street, and these machines, as they were also known, were ornately detailed with pictures, each signaling the separate creation of individual companies. And around 1840, they began wearing distinctive outfits of blue-black trousers, coat, thick boots, and their special flag, the red shirts, red flannel shirts. It was also the case, however, that laddies often seemed more interested in parading and notoriously in fighting rival companies than in dealing with fires. By the 1850s, there were thus calls to introduce not only more efficient steam-driven engines, but also paid firemen subject to centralized municipal discipline, and emblematic of the new regime, top-down imposed uniforms featuring dark blue shirts. Not remarkably, the heavily plebeian world of New York fire laddies greeted the prospect of these changes with resentment, challenging their proponents with sabotaged hoses, shouts of "man found dead," and dismissing the new costumes as livery. And so with police. By the 1850s, earlier systems of watchmen and fee-for-service patrolmen had begun giving way in New York to full-time officers on fixed salaries, subject to centralized command structures, operating under firmed-up rules and regulations, and wearing not just badges, but fully recognizable uniforms. Again, there was resistance, with the imposition of standardized costumes attracting special ire. While police were drawn from the upper tiers of white working men, they were rarely of higher or even middling standing, and they consequently reacted to the new uniforms as white lesser sorts often responded to mandated clothing, claiming in large outdoor demonstrations that the regulation garb would make them into, quote, liveried hackmen. Added to this were fears uniforms would make police visible and hence vulnerable to crooks, and resurrecting a vintage Republican nightmare would transform local constables into a standing army wielding authority over a civilian populace. In time, the resistance and fears faded. If by no means perfect, the reorganized firefighting and peacekeeping structures won sufficient public support to make the changes, including the uniform, seem sensible or at least irresistible. In fact, perhaps because of the patriotic feelings aroused by the Civil War, concerns about uniforms, even the worries about standing armies, gave way to general acceptance. Indeed, some lesser sorts gave signs of something beyond acceptance. They gave signs of active appropriation. For there are suggestions working people, with lesser-ranked firefighters and policemen leading the way, moved from the agency of resisting uniform to the agency of claiming these outfits as their own. And it's perhaps this new spirit that informs illustrations surfacing in the 1860s, because while not directly produced by or for lesser sorts, well, you can just see the dark blue shirts. These images surely transmit their pictured subjects' emergence allegiance to the new persona and look of New York firemen and policemen. A further crucial context for lesser sorts asserting their visuality was commercial entertainment. And I'm going to concentrate specifically here on the theater, which I think emerged as a vital venue for plebeian visuality. Working people asserted their visuality in the theater first by displaying themselves as theatergoers. For some while in these years, a number of New York playhouses continued the provincial practice of hosting different social ranks, albeit mostly white and at first mostly male, in different sections of their auditoriums. Middling and wealthy folks sat in boxes, assorted lower ranks stationed themselves in galleries above and pits below. More than ever before, however, lesser-ranked ticket holders now made themselves both audibly and visibly evident with robust performances of audienceship by cheering and booing the stage and using their, quote, disdain of either coat, vest, stockings, and sometimes even shoes to express entire contempt for polite company in the boxes. It was unmistakably a show alongside the show. But the very vigor of their audienceship affected what happened on stage, so that this enthusiasm, I will argue, encouraged those producing the shows, the actors, the entrepreneurs, and writers, to present plays and theatrical performances that these parts of the audience really enjoyed. Up to a point, this meant providing productions lesser-ranked theatergoers took as pleasurable alongside polite company. There were versions of Shakespeare that appealed to all strata. There were broadly pleasing dramas that explored history and mocked the wealthy, especially the nouveau riche. There were widely applauded plays foregrounding homespun Yankee types and frontier characters like the splendid Nimrod Wildfire. And there were extensively supported melodramas with their satisfying examples of right vanquishing wrong and, notably, I think, of characters who sincerely were just as they appeared. All these were presented in ways that satisfied not only middling and upper ranks, but strenuously responsive lesser sorts as well. But there were also complicating developments. In some New York theaters, most of them in working class districts, there were occasions of plays that catered mainly to lesser-ranked audiences. And these venues were at once particularly hospitable to rowdy audienceship and to staged entertainments that served the particular tastes of certain local plebeian constituencies. They staged blackface minstrel acts, for example, and they staged travesties that included the splendid New York fireman laddie and roustabout Mosey the Bowery Boy. Much has been written about both of these theatrical ventures, so I'll proffer just a few points. Minstrelsy, as it initially flowered in settings like New York, won cheers from inter-ethnic brigades of white working men who, sharing contemporary racial antipathies, delighted in performances of foolish black slave types like Jim Crow, like so. But minstrelsy's attractions were multi-layered. If it was racist, in its borrowings of both black appearance and dance steps simultaneously expressed willing appropriations by laboring whites of African-American culture. What's more, minstrelsy delighted white lesser sorts by advancing characters and routines through the picture of Zip Coon, for example. that mocked elite whites as much as pretentious free blacks. And crucially, to my mind, its insistent mobilization of blackface signaled an acceptance of disguise that went far beyond routine theatrical costuming. It signaled, I'd argue, a celebration of misappearance, of fakery, that working people of different ethnicities and races, and in ways quite different from middling and upper-ranked individuals, unapologetically affirmed to be every bit as legitimate as the sincerity touted in melodramas, as in fact a visual tactic that lesser sorts, unlike most middling and upper ranks, commonly believed could and should be joined with sincerity in coping with antebellum America. As for Mosey, this character initially drew applause from lesser-ranked theatergoers because he was familiar. Joining the real-life figure of New York's leisure-loving, watchfully lounging, laboring, and sometimes gang-joining laboring lads known as the Boys, B''H-O-Y-S, with the still-present figure of volunteer firemen, Mosey first strode the boards in 1849 as in the laddie's signature costume. There he is. He also initially pleased lesser sorts because he showed up in travesties, poking fun at dramas increasingly associated with non-plebeian theatrical venues. But just as important, Mosey was presented as rampantly eager to fight, to join in what he called musses, to defend his comrades, his girl Liza, the Bowery girl, but above all his reputation, his honor. And honor, while here and there endorsed by higher-ranked individuals, especially in the South, was another visually inflected stance toward life adamantly embraced by antebellum lesser sorts, especially males, but again males across ethnic and racial lines. In fact, plebeian honor was distinctive. It was pursued in markedly physical, no-holds-barred fights, and it easily overlapped with misappearance. Unlike non-workers, laboring sorts had little difficulty pursuing both fakery and honor, which had further implications. Honor had its own quarrel with sincerity overall. People committed to preserving outer faces had little interest in sincerely tethering interiors to surfaces, but the distinctive inflections of lesser-ranked honor meant its challenge to authenticity was also distinctive. So what I'm suggesting is that there were occasions when New York's lesser sorts, sometimes alongside non-working folk, sometimes by themselves, sponsored theatrical entertainment they enjoyed. And some of the entertainment they enjoyed offered visually staged crystallizations of values and priorities, which, if not always entirely unique to those below, were often especially expressive of lesser-ranked orientations that, again, cut across ethnic and, to some extent, even racial distinctions among working folk. So let's now turn back to what was happening outside playhouses. Admittedly, there was considerable overlap. After all, if it's true Mosey was based on real-life laddie boys, it's true as well that some of his lines in the plays, in the Mosey plays, became catchphrases among working New Yorkers. In fact, it's likely the slouching, cigar-holding stage pose inspired, you see he's got a cigar there, some of the whimsical photographic self-portraits cited earlier, like that daguerreotype with the two workers. Then two Whitman pretty clearly drew on theatrical formulations of the boy's must-loving, watchful lounging in crafting his own mode of regardful roaming. I lean and loaf, he wrote. I lean and loaf my soul, he famously declared. I lean and loaf at my ease. But there's more to say about working people's extra theatrical visuality, about their desire to dress well, for example. I've specified that the burgeoning production of cheap, stylish garments and clothing materials did not leave working people unrecognizable as laboring folk. The point I want to make now is that lesser sorts did nonetheless use these items to essay gestures at elegance. And they did so not just in non-occupational, non-whimsical portraits, photographic portraits mentioned earlier, but in other settings, after working hours, say, as they passed down New York streets. Now, to some extent, the fact lesser sorts could dress well on the street was taken as proof of America's successful experiment in democracy. The display of neatly attired laboring folk was thus now and again highlighted in the positive regard non-workers directed toward those below. but there were clearly contrary perspectives. Zip Coon, you remember him, and the era's racist caricatures demonstrate that hostility to Northern free blacks, often key to the purported presumptuousness of dressing up among these blacks. By the same token, white working folk donning elegant-looking attire were scolded by outside observers because such garb implied wasteful spending. Because even if not fully modish, technically fully modish, it threatened to erode social distinctions deemed requisite even in America. And because, especially in the case of white lesser-ranked women, it flagged a particular female vulnerability to luxury and quite possibly to the wicked ways of prostitution working women might use to support their hunger for finery. Yet New York's lesser sorts dressed up anyway. They did so partly because it was fun, because they wanted to mark holidays or activities like attending church or going to school, or because they reckoned good garb romantically attractive. But there were other motives. Free blacks dressed up because, in the face of New York's persisting strictures on their rights, extending the well-clothed look of fugitive frontispiece portraits to self-presentations on public streets, was effectively to declare that Gotham's blacks could appear as they wished, and in that sense, really were free. White working men dressed up because it marked their place as fully enfranchised citizens, and white working women with paying jobs reached for elegance because lacking specific garments stipulating their position as wage earners, excuse me, buying and wearing neat, as it was called, neat clothes comprised powerful announcements of the independence that wages might bring. But that, once again, there were complications. To start with, well-dressed lesser sorts exposed intricate byplays between class, race, and gender. The uppityness, contemporary term, ascribed to New York's fashionably costumed black laboring folk, drew reprimands from black as well as white non-workers, and hence exposed class fissures among Gotham's African Americans. At the same time, the independence signaled by well-dressed lesser-ranked women might well attach to the forays into sex for money these individuals now and again did use to secure modicums of economic autonomy, including from their own families. We do not, I think, need to romanticize prostitution in this era to suggest that dressing up did not so much force women to trade on sex as frequently join such transactions, especially their intermittent versions, in reflecting the desire of lesser-ranked females for independence, again, not accepting from their own relatives. As a result, the whole project to denote and secure female economic autonomy, very much extending to its banner of nice clothes, triggered scoldings not only from middle and upper-ranked observers, but from within lesser-ranked households also. A further complication turned on the actual appearance of dressed-up lesser sorts. For all the array of motivations and reactions surrounding their neat, non-workaday attire, the contents of these outfits typically, as we've remarked, amounted simply to approximations of fashion. Sorry, here's what I want. Here is Mosey and Liza on stage in a theatrical performance. Liza is dressed not extravagant, not excessively, but in her version of fashion. Yes? At times, though, I'd suggest that the dressing up among working people did more, went further. At times, the look of lesser-ranked elegance suggested an intentional plebeian dandyism, a purposeful, over-the-top stylishness gotten together, as one commentator wrote, quote, in utter defiance of conventional laws of harmony and taste, that was meant to challenge, even mock, respectable elegance, so that New York's dressed-up lesser sorts now and again offered themselves on the stage of city thoroughfares in displays that, even when depicted by outside picture makers, like so, clearly implied that those disparaged for dressing up were embarked on their own disparaging. The Soap Block Boys were a gang, ruffians, soap blocks to slick their hair down. Right? They used soap to slick their hair down. Now, the sometimes fractious display kicked up by dressed up working folk highlights something that's been running quietly through my discussion so far, the politics of lesser-ranked appearance. After all, in treating the visuality of those below as significantly shaped by these individuals, as significantly self-declarations, I'm taking their visual presence as an important part in how these people situated themselves, in how they themselves formed what we might call their class fit. As such, the agency infusing their visuality inevitably led them to engage, in varying ways and degrees, the inflections of power that defined and not uncommonly constrained that fit. Which is to say, I'm taking the appearance of lesser sorts as part of the overall engagement with power, and hence the politics, broadly conceived, enacted by pre-1860 working people in places like Gotham. In fact, I'd go further. I'd argue that considering lesser-ranked appearance helps us appreciate the spectrum of lesser-ranked politics. It's not just that the politics involve visuality. It's that, as we found, lesser-ranked undertakings to make their visuality itself range from presenting themselves as they wished in portraits, to both refusing and claiming uniforms, from using playhouses as settings for observably unruly behavior and encouraging certain kinds of performances, to dressing up outside playhouses in different ways and for all manner of reasons. And to these initiatives, I'd now also foreground looking back. At a time when, as suggested above, being lesser ranked often meant being increasingly regarded by others. It was no small matter that Gotham's lesser sorts claimed the right, whether as theatrical audiences or, as occasionally happened, as street-side bystanders, to look back at what was before them. Now, inhabiting as they did a political economy riven by basic and in many respects deepening inequality, lesser sorts can be understood as embarked on a visual politics virtually always flavored by some level of contestation, simply because virtually any visual self-declaration, even I'd suggest declarations rooted in fun, likely had to confront limiting resources and norms. Yet my point is emphatically not that all lesser-ranked visual interventions carried the same punch, or for that matter, that lesser-ranked visual agency per se was the same as, say, running for public office or waging strikes. The point, to reiterate, is that exploring appearance can disclose the range of politics among those below, and perhaps it can disclose something else. That different kinds of politics might overlap, that seemingly informal, fun-informed gestures like dressing up could mark, even foster, energies flowing into more formal arenas. It's surely no accident that the charismatic, albeit notoriously mercurial, worker politician Mike Walsh enjoyed presenting himself for election as very much the plebeian dandy. The practice of New York's lesser sorts to use city streets to display themselves and look back leads to my final topic, and I'm mindful of the time. The public dimension of lesser-ranked visuality and the bundle of politics it enfolded. In a sense, I've already broached this subject, for quite aside from the street-side venturing of plebeian elegance and watching, the way those below tussled over uniforms and behaved in theaters had public reverberations. But there were other reverberations. There were all manner of curbside socializing and commerce. There was street theater, like dancing for eels, practiced by local blacks, performances that might find their way into minstrel acts, but were birthed outdoors among local African Americans. There were the real-life battles between gangs and lesser-ranked Mosey-like individuals over honor. And while the years I'm covering do not include the notorious draft riots of 1863, they did host several street-filling tumults, some exposing raw ethnic and racial fault lines among those below, but most in any case setting lesser sorts off against municipal authorities. Then, too, some laboring folk participated in parades mounting by contemporary political parties, while others, from fire laddies to tradesmen, joined in public civic processions and ceremonies like July 4th celebrations. And finally, there were both parades and publicly observable meetings bearing on specific efforts by workers to challenge their employers. But once again, there's more to say. We should acknowledge first that most campaign and civic parades were closed to women and African Americans of any economic standings. Female likenesses might be found on banners, and women might well line parade routes, but their observing roles rarely carried the assertive import that could infuse lesser rank looking back elsewhere. And female physical participation as paraders in this period was quite limited. Gotham's blacks, for their part, managed for some years to balance their exclusion from white organized processions with their own parades, marking events important to their own community, like the end of slavery in New York in 1828, for example. But by 1840, this too had faded, a reflection of antagonism, some of it expressed in mobbish attacks faced by local African Americans. At the same time, though, and pushing from the other side, we should realize that withdrawing from public notice did not always mean defeat. Among the city's cohort of slave runaways, being not seen, certainly being not seen by slave catchers, was itself a political act, as was the effort by legally free blacks to monitor slave catchers and warn fugitives. We should also acknowledge the varying levels of visual self-consciousness attaching to mobs, fights, and processions involving lesser sorts. Major mobbish fracases with lower-ranked participants, like the Astor Place riot in 1849, were observed and depicted by non-working New Yorkers, and the resulting images, which often sought to pictorially contain the violence by displaying it at a distance, almost stage-like distance, and by suggesting the antagonists were not too off-putting, was part of the explanatory regard encompassing those below. But I'd suggest lesser sorts in the mobs likely did not themselves prioritize their appearance. By contrast, it was a crucial aspect of honor fights that they be observed, and the laddies and tradesmen in July 4th parades clearly believed the ceremonial citizenship they secured through these marches rested on both receiving public recognition as legitimate participants in these stridings through public space, and on drawing public praise for their often parade special garb and floats. The firemen had special outfits for July 4th parades. But I want to end with certain features emerging in, certain new features emerging in this period in the parades, processions, and meetings that workers mounted to confront their employers in this period. There were three new evolutions. First, at a time of mounting wariness about outdoor tumults, hostility, the nervousness about such riots, processions by workers to mark workplace protests, what they called their strike parades, were often criticized by both employers and city officials for being mobbish, for being almost as unacceptable as black parades. And as a result, these processions constituted public actions white workers had to defend with special fervor. Second, these processions, now and again, actually did involve women. I'm drawing here on developments outside New York, but also but across the North and known about in the city. For the fact is that if wages brought some autonomy to laboring women, wage work often brought hefty doses of exploitation. And hence, hefty instances, numerous instances of women taking to the streets to march to mark their strikes. And third, these collective actions, these parades, these strike parades, place major emphasis on appearance. Why? Because the protesters reckoned success would be more likely if they won public support. And they reckoned such support was more likely if they presented appealing looks. What's more, and what I think tellingly signals the mounting influence of represented visuality, participants in these protests led the way in attending increasingly not just to reactions by immediate onlookers, but to responses by individuals elsewhere, individuals whom the protesters expected, assumed, would learn about their marches via published descriptions and images. One expression of all this, and indeed of how politics could infuse dress and dress politics ramify out into other spheres, one expression of this was the extraordinarily self-conscious way striking women handled their apparel in their processions. At times, reflecting cautions against lesser sorts dressing up, they paraded in plain attire. They distinctly chose to dress down on their parades. Alternatively, though, they fused the bracing energy arising from wearing self-bought, neat garments with the calculation that such outfits would make them appear sufficiently respectable to warrant fair treatment. And thus inspired, they often enough marched in, this is a quote from a newspaper report, in their best bibs and tuckers. Or as documented in graphic and written descriptions in periodicals covering the 1860 Lynn shoemakers strike, depictions the strikers knew were forthcoming and that circulated through New York. They marched in affordable but still modish crinoline and splendid ruffled bonnets you can just see. That's my story. If nothing else, I hope I have in fact succeeded in suggesting possibilities. That the interactions of visualities can help disclose how working people like those in New York variously and collectively navigated 19th century America, and indeed that exploring the visual can lead not just to history that's illustrated, but to fuller understanding of history itself. Thank you.
So we'll take a short break and then reconvene to talk.
Other types of production, such as engraving, which was existing in newspapers for mass media production, and also in other countries such as woodblock prints, which were a substitute for painting to give to public consumption. So how did chromolithography take the place of those types of manufacturing?
Sure. I mean, it's not so much took the place of. A few things to think about. One of the things is that, especially for a mass audience, people liked color. And so chromolithography, you could print the color. You didn't have to do it by hand. So that, I mean, again, I love to have the examples in the exhibit to refer to. So that there are a couple of bird's eye views of Manhattan. One of them is colored, and then the later one is a chromolithograph. And what's remarkable to me looking at the two of those is how much chromolithography was used just to do the handwork quicker. Right, I mean, so that chromolithographic one isn't really a chromo in the sense of like trying to reproduce a painting. It's just a way to do by machine the same thing that you would do in hand coloring. I could give many answers, but let me just give you one more, which is something else to think about is the compatibility of one printmaking process with another, right? So that if you're like printing a newspaper, that you're printing that using cast type. It's a relief technique. Wood engraving, which is also a relief technique, goes well with that because you can print it on the same press. Lithography is a planographic technique. It's an entirely different process and equipment for printing. So that's part of why lithography did not displace other printmaking techniques, because it wasn't compatible through the printing process.
Let me jump in and ask you a question. After I promised I wouldn't do this. I mean, I think you made a really convincing argument for considering Rogers and Curry knives and Prang. And I guess I would ask the counterfactual, are they really doing the same thing, or would you dispute that let's say Curry knives and Prang are actually engaged in quite different enterprises, thinking about class segmented market, about relationship with artists? In other words, I'm asking you to go against your own argument.
Right, how are they different rather than how are they the same?
I mean,
no, I mean, I think that's right. I think that they're going for different markets or different segments of the market. For me, the fundamental commonality is that they're trying to make things that read as art, and they're using industrial technology to do it. And so all those other the differences that you can deduce, even just say between 2D and 3D, there's that fundamental commonality that is the thing that's most striking to me.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, I wanted to hear you talk about.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, I think that goes, it goes forward even to now, right? That it's since that moment of the possibility of industrially producing images to now, there's a commonality.
In this sort of, in their case, this workshop model, I'm trying to think of the scale between the three shops in terms of how many. Rogers would probably have Coronaz would have the largest. Well, I guess it would depend on where you put the praying in terms of earlier or later, in terms of the number of employees, the number of people working, how large scale the manufacturer would be. Okay, fair enough. Okay. Josh?
Jonathan, I wonder, I was curious about what your thoughts would be about another phenomenon, at least I think this is true, of dressing down for non-working class people. Particularly, I'm thinking of the number, particularly talking about the 30s and 40s of young, do you attend there?
Yeah. Say again? Yeah. I rely on the kindness of strangers.
The phenomenon of the young men coming into the city from the countryside, not immigrants, but the young men coming to the city, becoming clerks in some cases, so on and so forth, dressing up like soap blocks, a lot of them, joining, sort of the urban gangs at the period of time and so on. For all intents and purposes, dressing up to look tough and to join this sort of rough male culture.
But I thought you said you wanted to talk about dressing down.
Well, in the sense that, in reverse, that they're
taking on a lower ranked.
Exactly. That's part of their style.
Sure. Yeah, I just gestured. I mean, and it's country guys coming in, falling into the soap blocks, and other gangs. But I think it's also city-born guys. Both of these constituencies using a style of dressing up to act tough, as you say, and to ironically distance themselves from the middling and upper. I mean, they accent it. I don't know if you can see in this picture, they just do a little too much, or maybe a lot too much, to basically be thumbing their nose. The so-called Bowery Boys were famous for their top hat. Mosey, in that picture with Liza, I didn't have time to go into this, he's dressed as a butcher, but he's also dressed as a Bowery Boy with the top hat. And it is it's a vehicle. It's dressing up with an attitude. It's dressing well with an attitude. That means they're dressing a little too much. I thought you were going to go another way, so let me ask what you should have asked. There is also the phenomenon in the 1840 election when the Whigs wanted to, as you may know, the Whigs wanted to capture working class votes, and so they deployed endless cartoons and pamphlets and pictures and banners of their candidates in shirt sleeves, right? So the non-genteel look could take on the notion of virility, authenticity, and so forth. So it's a complicated conversation going on.
Hi, thank you both for both of your talks. And I have a question that might unite both what Michael and Jonathan did. I'm interested in the phenomenon, particularly in the Five Points area of New York, of tableau vivants. Tableau vivants, the kind of staged, embodied perception of artwork. So my question for Michael is, I know about the instances of people using the Greek slave as an opportunity to do, this is like a forerunner to burlesque. These stage, sometimes I call them modeled artist performances. So they're live things that happen in music halls and saloon theaters at this time where people stage art. So for Michael, do you know of any occasion, or maybe Jonathan, you would know, if there were occasions of the Rogers couplings or any of those groupings being the source of tableau vivants, or is it only, it would be ironic if it is only a kind of idealized high culture that then working people are costuming themselves to take on, and other spectators in the mostly German saloon theaters came to see. So I wondered if either of you knew about that, because it feels like it speaks to, it's a performative phenomenon in New York that speaks to both of your work.
Yeah, I don't, it'd be fascinating if there were, and so it seems to me like it would be somehow not of the genre properly to do a tableau vivant of
Checkers,
a Rogers group, right? Because it's not it's not in another realm that you can then bring into your own everyday life and act it out. It's already trying to present itself as everyday life, even though, as I would say, it's much idealized. But yeah, I don't know of any acting out.
Well, I'm going to go another way. When you said tableau vivant, my understanding, and you mentioned 5 points,
Right.
there were all were there not? I ask other historians in the room. My sense is there were instances of art shows, big air quotes, of naked women. And it was okay, or kind of okay, or not quite not okay, because they were presented as artful. They were peep shows, for God's sake. That's what they were. 1840s, 50s, and so forth. Masking or framed or something presented for the cops, the police, the newly uniformed police as art.
Right.
That's one point. There's also the fact that, and I alluded to this a little bit, that stage acts, be they minstrelsy or mosey, were then enacted in the street. I mean, you have dancing for eels and other forms of black dancing taken to the stage, then brought back to the street, and in some cases ultimately brought into homes, as there were little how-to books on how to do minstrelsy in your parlor. Parlor. But also parts of the Mosey plays were apparently enacted by kids and young men al fresco on docks in front of firehouses.
And newsboys.
And newsboys, right. So the boundary between stage and street was complex and porous.
The digital publication that accompanies the exhibit has an essay on tableau vivant by Kelsey Brow.
So am I right? Is it dirty stuff?
She actually starts in the early 20th century and works backwards. And so she starts with sort of wealthy families that did private theatricals and then does move, as she goes retrospectively, discovers them in a wider range and different social classes. So I would steer you to that in thinking about. So that's.
My question is related to the one that was just asked, and I direct it primarily to Jonathan. Have you noticed anything in gesture in your? You talk a lot about clothes. Clearly, they're theatrical gestures, but is there also bodily comportment that helps your argument?
Yes. Oh, you want to know what?
Something more about it.
That Astor Place picture with the careerized print of the Astor Place Shrine, and I would, sitting next to you as a scholar of the draft riots, my glimpse of those images, and even war, not photographs, but war scenes, paintings, drawings, filled with eye gestures
Right.
you know, that are taken, I think, from the stage.
But I was also thinking about proper versus improper bodily comportment at the time. Understandings about elite posture versus middling versus lower sorts.
The closest answer I can give is the way working guys especially, well, women too, now that I think of it, in those occupationals, they gave themselves license to, you know, the cigar. Sometimes they are literally mugging in group photos. I mean, they're literally doing this. Making fun of the whole situation in a way that was rarely seen in middle class, even photographic images, till later.
I want to jump in, and I was really struck in Michael's presentation about the nostalgic sort of agrarian playing out for an urban audience. And I was wondering, was that a necessary condition for this point in time for popular art? Are there other, in this, but there's always, everything is a historical transition, but certainly in this sort of, agrarian to urban moment. On the other hand, Courier Knives, as we looked at in the gallery, has urban views, which I would, I guess, argue celebrate urbanness. Are there other art entrepreneurs who are not as wedded to the agrarian, or is that more of a sort of less popular mode of visual representation?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, Courier Knives is a sort of interesting marginal problem case. I think they made as many different kinds of images as they possibly could, and they would sell whatever to whoever. But one thing I would say that it's not a transitional moment, except in a very broad sense, is that there's a transition from before the Industrial Revolution to after the Industrial Revolution, and it's the before and after. And so if you look at, as I was just briefly suggesting, Maxfield Parrish, Norman Rockwell, Thomas Kincaid, it's still, if not agrarian, at least pastoral, pre-industrial ideal, right? But produced by machine.
But Rockwell works really well, and so it's become in the 20th century small town America.
It's community. It's a notion of community.
Communitas.
Almost more than farming, isn't it? Maybe not.
So
what about the wallpaper then? Because and I had to walk out from the gallery to walk this morning, so I didn't know if you talked about it. But the wallpaper domesticates a very urban view, and what do you have to say about that? I mean, I understand wallpaper isn't as mass-produced as a cheap Courier Knives litho, but somebody clearly wanted to bring the urban into their domestic space and didn't want to banish the banish it and replace it with something nostalgic.
So then I guess the question would be, and I don't know enough about the maker of the wall. This is the wallpaper that's in the parlor in the Visualizing 19th Century New York exhibit, as to how popular that was, how common. I think from the discussion we did have in the gallery, there was one other example of European wallpaper that had similar urban depictions, but this was seemingly not a familiar sight. So it becomes more... So
that's your example in the exhibit of the idiosyncratic rather than the typical.
Well, in that case. I mean, I'm
just wondering if there's a rivalrous idiom of urban pride emerging, right? I mean, because in San Francisco in 1870, when they're talking about making civic spaces, they talk about wanting to have their own central park, right? At a certain point, around mid-century, New York becomes iconic in and of itself, and so I could imagine one wanting to internalize pictures of New York as a mode of demonstrating pride as opposed to only wanting to banish it.
Well, that is the premise in the exhibit of, let's say, the Anthony Broadway on a Rainy Day, which is an instantaneous stereo view of a rain-slick street out Edward Anthony's Emporium. So, and so that, I think, is an unabashed, though others might agree or disagree, unabashed celebration of sort of, sort of city life with bustling pedestrians. I mean, and that is not that uncommon. So I guess.
I mean, would it be helpful to suggest that? Would it be helpful to suggest that there is, and some of us were saying it earlier today, that there may be emerging in this period New York imposing its image on the country as iconic, and as Josh said, even maybe imposing its vision of other cities as what they should look like. But at the same time, at least some of the market, customers, the clientele for genre paintings were urban. So that right? So that you have, it's not that the city was devoid of self-celebrations, it's that the city also was supplying constituency for rural. I don't know if that helps.
I mean, there's certainly are competing ideals, and the choices that people are making sort of with their feet where they live and work, they move to the city. But for me, then the question is about the social function, right? So art is a sort of hedge bet on that main commitment, I would say, right? So you live in the city, you have your job in the city, but your art is about an alternative ideal.
And where you came from, maybe.
Or at least where
if you're the Beachers, it's got a whole sort of domestic ideology about the separation that happens from the city once you cross the threshold of the home. But I was also thinking about, and I will stop monopolizing, but something like Lily Martin Spencer, right? Who isn't popular in this, I mean, she does do designs for chromos, but she also uses broad, brash humor, and the city that she shows is one of uncomfortable social encounter between different registers. And I mean, I guess for 5 points, we might also think about the Catlins that are in the Met of 5 Points and Moving Day, where clearly there's some audience that's also looking for urban images, and can that also be a strain of the popular that is maybe more akin to minstrel shows or some of the other dimensions of mass culture that the other talk was bringing up? And is that popular art? Can we expand popular art to include that kind of material as well?
Sure, but it's a question of what will you bring home as art, right? I mean, so yes, there's an audience for Spencer.
So Martin Spencer's didn't go into people's homes?
They did, but just, I mean, think about that in terms of numbers compared to Prang, who's, group of chickens, 30,000 copies in the first 2 years. So I guess you can't say like, well, there was this strain and there was not that strain, but it's a matter of trying to say, well, what was culturally the most important impulse? And what I'm trying to argue is that
conservatism is the most important cultural impulse.
Well, I mean, I took Michael's argument to be also that when they were constructing these or creating these or choosing these from numerous possibilities, they chose those of the broadest, to their conception, the broadest popular appeal, which even though, I mean, a lot of Jonathan's images were also circulated, but maybe not in the same numbers. But then maybe by the 1870s, I would think you're starting to get something different going on too, if you're thinking of the illustrated periodical press too, and that's another source that's different than freestanding prints.
Yeah, I have actually a question that's similar. Is about what do you know about the non-urban market? Right, we've talked a lot about this having some national circulation, right? It's a huge market. So what about the people who aren't in urban areas that are buying this? It's a difficult reception question. And I guess the other question that goes along with it is like, what do you mean by nostalgia in this time, in this particular, can you historicize nostalgia as you're reading it in this time period?
Well, I'm from Texas, and my great aunt lived in a little tiny town called Troop, Texas, and she had a Kincaid print or whatever, that she was one of her prized possessions. So to me, it certainly did have an effect on the rest of the country.
I mean, so let me just say a little bit about what you can say and how you can say it. Yeah, so it was, the markets were developed partly by publications, and we know, for instance, where Rogers advertised. But it's always the case with popular art that you're seeking large numbers for your audience. So that even as you go, further west, or you're always looking for population centers, right? You don't want to have, you don't really have a out in the country agent, right? Even if you have a far-flung agent selling this popular art, it's in town. It is a difficult reception question to get down to the level of, well, who exactly bought these? There are some nice photographs. General Custer had Rogers groups that he took with him on the road, and there are some nice photographs of him with his groups, and just accounts by him of how they would get broken, and he would have to then glue them back together and try to do the joints and putting them back together. But we don't have the really fine-grained reception information to draw on. So part of the way that I work is just by looking at the images and seeing what kind of ideal vision do they project. But we do, you can say at least very broadly that the audience is primarily urban, or whether that means a city or a smaller town, and that the views portrayed are much less urbanized, populated, and industrialized than the lives of the people that are looking at the images.
And the historicizing of nostalgia, the second.
Historicizing of nostalgia.
Well, I know that this is a period of time where post-Civil War, there's a notion, there's a big discourse about it in the medical profession having to do with homesickness during wartime. And that's actually where the term nostalgia starts to enter into broader discourse, right? But it doesn't have the same kind of resonance, I think, the way you're using it now, which is this kind of, pastoral idealization. There may have been different kinds of language that's used for that. So I'm curious about, what kind of language do you see surrounding these images, and how is it that you come to call that nostalgia? I mean, I take your point about the pastoral and the rustic.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, again, the big before and after is before and after industrialization. And when people are looking back, they're looking back to a time that they imagine is in the very recent past. I mean, even you could do this with Norman Rockwell, that the time that he imagines, it's back in the past, but so close to the present that it could be the present, or at least you can imagine it being the present in some places. And I think that was the case for Rogers in his time. Or for instance, the Prang's Barefoot Boy. I mean, that is an image that is published after the Civil War, but it's based on a painting and a poem that is from before the Civil War, and it's partly pre-industrial. It's also partly pre-Civil War. All those young men that were killed, and then now we have this sort of icon of the barefoot boy as a sort of magic dream replacement or compensation. So yeah, historicizing nostalgia. It's looking back beyond the watershed of the Civil War is one way to historicize it, but I think the main thing is to look back to a pre-industrial agrarian era.
It's a sharp line to you, industrial?
No, I mean, of course it isn't. I can't sit next to this guy and
he's in this debate too. So
no, but I just know that your well-developed argument about the very fuzzy line between urban and rural and in pre and post-industrial. It's a long process.
I mean, also there's one foot here for these newly urban people. Generationally, they have 1 foot in an agrarian world and 1 foot in the urban. For internal immigration, which is, I forget my New York City population numbers, but exponential growth.
Right.
Was there a question?
Oh, me? Yeah, I did. I was just curious about if there was a sartorial influence of the dressing down on the, I guess you'd have it like bespoke couture at the time, sort of like the 80s street chic on Yves Saint Laurent or something.
Lost the last one.
Oh.
No, bespoke I got.
I'm saying the analogy I made was to the 1980s street chic on designers, on couture designers.
So you're asking, did high-end fashion trousers? Trousers came from working men and were adopted as fashionable by gentlemen. Both sides of the England and America, got rid of breeches and put on trousers. Late 18th, early 19th century. There is a revolutionary amidst the revolutionary moment. There is a apparent. We're not going to be as fashionable as England. We're going to dress more plainly. Of course, our plain clothes will be beautifully cut and of gorgeous material. As I said, the thing I mentioned to Josh, there was a moment politically when gentlemen politicians took off their coats and performed politics in shirt sleeves to signify their authenticity. I can't easily think in this period of, pulling in plebeian garments as.
Thank you.
Can I go back one? Sure.
Unilaterally? No, I mean, there's nostalgia, past, present. I think what's in the antebellum period, what's working here is that past and present are also being coded as rural and urban, which is to say, the genre paintings we talked about, some of these prints, the past is the country. There are to my knowledge, there are very few evocations of New York in the 18 teens. You would know better than I, David. But I mean, if you want to talk about the past, you reach for the countryside, don't you?
Well, the implications you have from the 18 teens or 1790s on, of course, are more traditional Claudian landscape with a Brooklyn Heights or pastoral foreground.
In 1850, if you want to talk about the past, it's not
going to be New York.
Dutch New York.
Right? No, that's not the Dutch colonial revival. Other questions? Well then, I guess I will invite folks to move to the 6th floor where we have a reception and you can converse informally with our speakers, talk to each other, whatever, and look at the view. For all I know, it's raining or something's happened in the last 8 hours since we've been outside. No. So please join us, and also a hand for our speakers.